prescribing certain processes. This means that plenty of developers work with an agile mindset without even realizing it. The manifesto merely formalizes how many successful teams have always worked. The real problem with the manifesto today is not whether it is relevant, but how it is applied, or rather, how it is applied incorrectly. Many organizations are going through the motions of agile without getting the benefits, without understanding the why of it. In order to be effective, underlying structures and cultures have to be supporting agile. Spin Chennai has been in the forefront of evangelizing agile. Incidentally, our last physical session, Dual Dialogues, was on agile. When we discussed with Steve on the topic, he immediately said, without batting an eyelid, doing agile right, transformation without chaos is the topic. In his clear-eyed and indispensable book, Bain and Company and HPR authors Steve Berez, Darrell Rigby, and their colleague Sarah Ek provide a much-needed reality check. They dispel the myths and misconceptions that have accompanied Agile's growth. The idea that it can reshape your organization all at once, for instance, or that it should be used in every function for all types of work. These are all some of the myths and misconceptions they have cleared. They affirm and illustrate that agile teams can indeed transform the work environment, make people's jobs more rewarding, and turbocharge innovation, but only if the method is fully understood and implemented the right way. The key, they argue, is balance. Every organization must optimize and tightly control some of its operations. At the same time, every organization must innovate. So Agile, done well, frees and facilitates vigorous innovation without sacrificing the efficiency and reliability essential to traditional operations. So there are a variety of topics covered in their book on doing Agile right, including Agile planning, budgeting, reviewing, the structures, the people management, scaling Agile, leadership, Agile in crisis, unbalanced company, things like that. So coming to Steve Berez, he's a partner at Bain and Company and co-author of the new book, Doing Agile Right, from the Harvard Business Press. He's a founder of Bain's enterprise technology practice and was its America's head from 2013 through 2018. He is also a senior leader in Bain's agile innovation and healthcare practices. Steve first joined Bain in 1980, way back. That is like 40 years ago, more than, and has been with the firm, over the last 30 plus years. Over the past decade, he has helped dozens of firms across industries and around the world improve the speed, agility, and effectiveness of the technology-based innovation. Steve has driven agile transformations for industry leaders in health, P&C, and life insurance, healthcare delivery, retail banking, consumer and industrial products, retail, transportation, and technology. He also has deep experience in technology, strategy, and operating model redesign, especially in the context of digital strategy and innovation, software engineering and product management, architecture transformation, complexity reduction, including cloud adoption and core systems modernization, and technology-enabled growth strategy. Steve's recent articles include the Agile C-Suite, Harvard Business Review, Agile is Not Enough, Sloan Management Review, It's Time to Rethink the IT Talent Model, again Sloan Management Review, How Agile is Powering Healthcare Innovation, in Vivo, and 4 Myths of Digital Transformation, what only 8% of companies know, Bain.com. Steve received an MBA from Stanford University, where he was named a Miller Scholar. He also earned a BS in Computer Science and Engineering from the MIT, where he received MIT's highest award, the Compton Prize. He has Agile certificate in Scrum and he is based in Boston. We are really fortunate to have him, share his thoughts today with us. Please keep updating your questions in the chat facility available. At the end of this talk, I will be relaying some of the relevant questions to Steve for his response. In case we do not have time to get all your questions answered, Steve will respond with his answers later, which we will be relaying to you. Please keep your audio in mute, and only when called for, you may unmute. Doing Agile Right is an important agenda item for Spin Chennai. and so we want to take it forward with its member organizations as well. So without spending any more precious time, I would like to invite Mr. Steve Berez to enlighten us on what he sees are important items for organizations to succeed with Agile. I encourage each and every one of you to unmute at this point. I will give 10 seconds and put your hands together to welcome Steve Berez to address pinch. Over to you, Steve.
Roger, thank you so much for that generous introduction and an endorsement of our book. Good morning and good evening, everyone. I'm really delighted to be with you today. Very much appreciated the offer to address your group and your organization, both in Chennai and the affiliates in other cities and countries are really groups that I've admired over the years in terms of what you try to accomplish with your members and the goals that you seek. So it's really a pleasure to be with you. I'm going to hopefully successfully share my screen. Let's see. How are we looking?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, very good. All right. This just lays out a few of the our book and a few of the articles we've had recently in Harvard Business Review, Sloan Management Review, if you're looking for more information about the book, including some supplemental content, you can see the website in the upper right, bain.com/Doing Agile Right. Now, the most important thing about Agile is shown right on this page. We believe if you and your team are not having fun with Agile, you're not doing it right. Because done right, Agile improves not only the lives of our customers, but also the lives of our team members and our communities, and certainly our shareholders if we're working for public companies. So, as Rashran was talking about the relevance of Agile today, especially in this pandemic year, we should keep in mind it's really not as much of an aberration as you think. We call them black swan events, but in fact, there are always unexpected crises. Pandemic this past year, or economic depression, but also natural disasters and data breaches and trade wars, social unrest, regulations coming due, financial shocks, etc. So companies are always faced with the unexpected, and for them to succeed in meeting those needs, they really need to be much more agile than most companies are today. So the good news is that in these very difficult times that have required a great deal of change, we're seeing increasing interest in Agile. And people, whether they know it's Agile or not, they're making faster decisions, they're being forced into greater creativity, testing and learning and trying new things. So those are all things that are advancing the cause of Agile. But there's some bad news also, which is that innovation is haphazard. Customers, they're continuing to want more and different things in this environment. And employees, we keep hearing, are getting burned out and they're struggling with red tape. And we're really concerned, and many of the companies we speak with are concerned that this agility is just going to snap back into old behaviors once the crisis passes, and companies really won't have gained much from the short-term behaviors that they've been forced into. So the question we're being asked is, how do we actually systematize this agility, which we're being forced into right now? And the ambition that most of our companies we work with are seeking is to build a business that will thrive in a world of unpredictable and accelerating change. Like the cheetah here, which is the most agile animal in the world, can run at 100 miles an hour and practically turn on a dime. That's what we're looking for our companies to do. We want an organization that's obsessed with learning, innovation, and growing, and deliver superior results. And as I was saying, this should be not only for customers, but for employees at all levels and roles, from senior management right to the front line, and shareholders and our communities. That's what we're trying to do with success in agility. It's not agility for agility's sake. It's in the service of these communities and stakeholders. The most important concept that we have found over the years that really helps explain how companies should best be organized is that businesses all need to do two things. They need to run the business effectively and efficiently. We'll call that operations. And they need to change the business. We'll call that innovation. So on running the business, what companies are seeking to do is to make proven successes repeatable. Once they know how to, let's say, make a hamburger as McDonald's, we want them to make it exactly the same way each time, so it tastes exactly the same wherever they're getting it. We want to eliminate waste, and we want to develop stable and predictable processes. So when running the business, we're looking to minimize variability. Lean Six Sigma is a very good technique for that. It measures and seeks to eliminate variability in running the business. However, when we're looking to change the business, when we're looking to innovate, it's really, the objectives are quite different. We want to fight stagnation. We want to limit losses from ineffective variations, and we want to grow gains from successful variation. So while running the business is trying to keep things stable, changing the business is trying to change. So these two things can be in conflict. And the real question is, how do you do both successfully and also harmonize the two? What we find is that the majority of businesses, this running the business part has really overtaken the focus of the business. And it means that we've fallen into this loop of predicting, commanding, and controlling in everything we do. We have bureaucratic managers who plan and execute work. The work is very carefully supervised. People operate as predictably as machines. That's what this run the business part has been striving for. And the culture becomes very boss-centric rather than customer-centric. That's how when I go into a business, that's the first thing I'm looking for, is whether people are looking to please the boss or people are looking to please the customer. If it's the boss, I know this is not an agile organization. But these practices have really kind of squeezed out the innovation in so many businesses. So what we're looking to do, and these businesses, they really think of innovation just like an assembly line. Where you first start at one end of the line by analyzing a problem, then you generate ideas, then you predict the specific requirements. Now, this is really the key place that this model goes wrong, because as it turns out, our predictions are very, very poor. We get the ideas, we believe we know the ones that are going to work, but as it turns out, rarely are those the ones that customers actually want in the end. But we take that prediction, we have faith in it, and we design, we develop, we verify and test, integrate, deploy, and maintain. But we've built something that is not necessarily, and more often than not, is not what the customer wants. So Agile recognizes that the majority of innovations fail. When we look at data from Inc., only a third of businesses actually changed very little from their initial concept in order to be successful. 2/3 of them went through moderate or significant change in the original idea. And in working with venture capitalists, we see a fairly similar relationship where almost 2/3 of companies needed to adapt their original model in order to succeed. And that includes some pretty well-known companies. So I'm not sure how many of you know that Slack started not as a collaboration company, but as a video game company. and it was a miserable failure. And in trying to salvage some value from this failure, the new owners came in and they said, is there anything here of value? And they found that the engineers in the back room had been using this collaboration tool. And this collaboration tool was actually pretty cool. And that's what they turned into Slack. So that clearly that required a big pivot. Their predictions of what the company could do were pretty bad. YouTube did not start out as a generalized video sharing app. It started out as a video dating application, and they expected people to put kind of advertisements about themselves, and other people would look at them, and this would be a video dating site. Well, that was a miserable failure, but it turned out that they found when they opened it up to other types of videos, it became very popular, and the rest is history. Or let's say the Slinky. I don't know how many of you have been around long enough to ever heard of the Slinky, but when I was growing up, we didn't have a lot of electronic toys. We had a lot of mechanical toys, and one of my favorites was a Slinky. Now, it's a kind of a spring, and you can put it on the steps, and it kind of goes and walks down the steps and does other pretty cool things. Well, this was not invented as a toy. This was actually invented as a device to stabilize nautical instruments at sea. But the inventor, one day it fell off his shelf onto his desk, and it kind of did this spinny thing, and then it fell onto his chair and onto the floor. He went, that's a pretty cool toy. So what we see here, the moral of the story is that if we're going to be successful in innovation, we better be able to pivot. We better be able to envision other things and get feedback on what is working and what is not working. So what this moves us to is from the traditional approach to innovation, where we're trying to have perfect predictions and plans. We're using surrogates for customers. We're figuring out, well, what does our senior executive think about the idea? Not what our customers, just we're using surrogates for them. And we have these infrequent big bang releases when we've designed and built something and then hope the market likes it, but again, more often than not, they don't. And it moves that paradigm to a very different one where we're rapidly learning and adapting. We have deep co-creation with customers. We have very much faster releases and recognition of value. And because of that feedback, we're able to adapt our product or service much more rapidly and make it something that customers more and more want. So what we see is that Agile actually works empirically. It is more successful at delivering projects. This specifically relates to technology projects. It's particularly more effective at delivering large projects. It doubles the success rate of large projects. Now, these rates probably look pretty low nonetheless, and what that says is Agile is not a panacea. There's a lot of other things you need to do to be successful besides Agile, but we know that Agile is probably the single biggest change you can make to traditional projects to dramatically increase their success rate. And Agile has other benefits besides just the project success, which is defined as coming in on time, on budget, and with the projected business value. Agile teams tell us that it allows them to better manage changing priorities, create more visibility and alignment with the business, improve team morale, again, back to having fun, and improve time to market. So lots of benefits when you do Agile well. Now, I believe most of you are quite familiar with Scrum and how an Agile team works. And you can see the benefits of the Agile team. But what we find in working with companies, and I work with some companies that not only have hundreds of Agile teams, but have thousands of Agile teams. While they have a lot of Agile teams, they aren't actually an Agile business. So just the sum total of lots of agile teams does not mean the business is agile. And sometimes these agile teams are not nearly as effective even as individual teams because of things around them that are constraining their ability to do their work. So really the core subject of our book is how to create an agile operating model or an agile business system. Ultimately an agile enterprise, not just a collection of agile teams. And let's look at some of the components to make that happen. Now, we talked before about the need to both run the business and change the business. And ultimately, that involves getting to what Aristotle called the golden mean, the sweet spot between two different forces that are going to give us the best results. And in this case, we're talking about the range between a company being too static and being unable to change and adapt. And we know, many companies, Kodak and Polaroid and Xerox and many others that have over the years taken leading market positions and squandered them because the businesses were too static. But we've also seen the other end of the spectrum when businesses are changing so rapidly, they have no controls, they become chaotic. And you see companies like Uber, let's say, that at one point in their lifetime got to that point of chaos that was really hurting the business because they had so few control. So somewhere in the middle between that stasis and that chaos is what we call agility, where we have the right balance between controlling the business, but also innovating and being able to change the business. What we've seen is that achieving that agility requires adjusting a range of these factors within the business system. So the purpose and values of the business, the strategy of the business, leadership and culture, planning, budgeting, and reviewing, structure and accountabilities, talent engine, et cetera. So on something like leadership and culture, the static end would be authoritarianism or Taylorism, where leaders are just really dictating everything each layer of the organization is doing down to the next layer, right to the front line. The other end of the spectrum is benign neglect, where leaders say, do your own thing. But in the middle is a culture of learning and growth. So each of these dimensions has that sweet spot, and it's not the same for every organization. Another key point in our book is that copying, just kind of cutting and pasting an agile model from one company to another, is not likely to be successful because no two companies are alike and no two agile models are going to work precisely the same in different companies. The key is for each company to use an agile approach to become agile and adjust these factors in a way that's going to optimally balance running the business and changing, innovating business. I'm going to just spend a few minutes on a couple of these topics, but let's start with leadership, because leadership and culture, because when we ask agile teams what challenges them to achieve success, we can see that 4 of the top challenges relate to leadership or culture. So the general organization resistance to change, not enough leadership participation, an organization culture at odds with agile values, inadequate management support, and sponsorship. I'm sure many of you have experienced these things, and whether you are a member of a leadership team that isn't adapting quickly enough, or whether you're being kind of held back by such a leadership team. So what we encourage companies to do is to think about adopting agile principles throughout the company. These are things like customer obsession, respect for individuals and empower diversity, small team spirit, trust, psychological safety, meaningful impact of work, etc. So even though we believe that agile teams or agile practices are best for innovation, but not for actually operating the business, these agile principles can permeate the entire business, both operations and innovation. Now, the innovation teams themselves, they'll have a whole set of additional practices, so small, dedicated, multidisciplinary teams. These are the things you're very familiar with, focus on prototypes and fast sprints and feedback and daily stand-ups. All these things are appropriate for individual innovation teams and groups of innovation teams, but the values and mindsets should permeate the company. And that starts with the executive team. The very most senior team of the company should itself be an agile leadership team, working as an agile system together, with the most important objective of that team to create an agile enterprise, an agile business system. And each member of this team has their own role to play. So the CEO owns the agile operating model. The chief marketing officer can help bring a customer focus and customer data to the rest of the team. The chief financial officer is going to be leading an adaptive planning and budgeting system, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Very different than traditional kind of project and program funding. The CIO can drive technology through the business. They're often the ones most familiar with agile practices that can help educate their peers on those, and so forth. So each member of this team bringing their own capability to bear, but acting as a team for the benefit of the entire corporation, as opposed to focusing on the benefit of their functional silo, which is how we see too many executives working today. What that means is that these executives really change the way they allocate their time. And our experience shows that before Agile and traditional management teams, senior leaders might only be spending 10% of the time on strategy, development, and growth, maybe about a third on talent and culture, and 60% of the time on just managing the operation, because they're micromanaging. They're being very hands-on. They're not empowering their people to do those things. In agile enterprises with executive teams that are working in these new ways, they're able to quadruple the amount of time they spend on strategy, development, and growth by dramatically reducing the time they spend on operations and management, because they're empowering their reports and the front line to work on the operations, to free up the things that only the senior management can do, which is helping set the direction of the company, helping making the big strategic decisions and moves. And then they're still spending maybe 30 to 35% of the time on talent and culture management, but it's much more around empowering, educating, motivating, as opposed to controlling and evaluating the people. So that's a very important change in direction. And even though you don't have to start with these senior management teams working this way in order to be successful at the start with Agile, we see most Agile efforts really run into a roadblock if at least partway through they don't get the senior management team on board. Now, many people think that to create an agile enterprise requires a dramatically different organization structure, one that might not even look like a traditional company. Well, we actually believe that's far from the truth. When you see this structure, the first thing you might notice is it actually kind of looks like a lot of companies look. It's got business units, divisions, etc., some centralized functions, technology, marketing, and finance. So the organization structure may not look that different than what we're used to seeing, but the way that we work within those structures is quite different. These red circles and gray circles represent agile teams, so that innovation work is being done by these agile teams. And the gray and red blocks represent the operation. So in each area, we have a certain innovation going on, a certain amount of operations. And this reflects our belief that agile innovation teams should be working as closely as possible to the business areas that they support and that they're working to change. The red teams are persistent teams. that are working on a long-term mission. The gray teams, the gray circles are temporary teams or projects. So we believe that the majority of innovation should be done with persistent teams, especially in technology, and that these teams are going to be more effective long-term in the innovation they're doing, because they have a better understanding of themselves and a better understanding of their products and customers. The gray blocks are the operations. Again, they're working with agile values, even though they're not working with agile practices. And the red blocks, those are groups supporting agile teams, even though they're not directly working on agile teams. And then finally, you'll see those red arrows. What that means is that regardless of where the teams are located within the organization, they're probably made up of cross-functional members from a lot of different parts of the organization. And that's what the red arrows are meant to signify. So we've talked at this point kind of in general about agile teams that are doing innovation. And many of those teams are innovating new products and services, but we also know that agile teams are very good at innovating business processes, improving the way the business does its work. And then we especially know that agile teams are very good at changing and innovating with technology and data that support those business processes, that support the products and services. So I'm going to turn now and focus more on the use of agile teams for software development, whether that's for software companies developing their products, or whether that's for companies across industries that are using software to run their business. When we think about those dimensions, many of those dimensions I showed you before on that agile operating model, those spectrums, many of those require very specific things to work in a certain way in order to be effective with software development. So for structure and accountabilities, we need the software teams to have empowered product management that are trusted from usually members from the business that are able to make the majority of decisions quickly and guide the teams in a very clear product roadmap. Typically, these teams are structured in what we call a taxonomy of persistent teams that are deployed against all the different parts of the business functions that are needed, and both all the capabilities the business needs to run the business and service customers, and all the underlying software systems that support that. And these teams use converged backlogs where they are doing the run and change within the same agile team. That tends to work best with software. And the management system, agile planning, budgeting, and reviewing. I'm going to talk more about that in a few minutes, using primarily persistent team funding. I've talked about already the leadership and culture, but we also want DevSecOps culture to be working, which is very much of a cross-functional and ownership mindset. And then our support and control functions need to show up in an agile way. If we have regulatory or compliance elements of our business, for example, in a bank or insurance company or healthcare company, those support and control functions need to work with agile teams in a way that enables their speed as opposed to slow them down. Many things have to change about talent for these teams to be effective. The engineering practices and talent has to be upgraded in many organizations. We're really empowering the engineers with more decision rights. They have to have more talent and skills to be able to do those effectively. Our location strategy needs to reflect, where possible, co-located teams and being in locations with sufficient talent. But we also need to be able to work effectively with distributed teams and have the technologies and collaboration tools when that becomes necessary, as it certainly has been this past year. And we also need to work differently with vendors than traditional models. Most commonly, having vendors supply teams, agile teams, as opposed to fixed deliverables or with kind of very waterfall contracts. And then finally, on the technology and data side, it's very important to work towards modular architecture. This is what allows individual teams to minimize interdependencies and to be able to work most rapidly. And then we also need not only the DevSecOps culture, but we need the underlying tools and automation to be able to make our teams be able to work very rapidly. So this is a full set of things required for software development in an agile way. We talk about this in the book. We also have supplemental content that goes a bit deeper on technology topics on our website. I'm just going to drill down into a couple of these right now, but I'm happy to talk about any others of them as we get into the Q&A. This looks like a pretty complicated chart, but what it really means to demonstrate is the left side is a very traditional IT organization structure, and the right side is what we typically see with an agile structure. So you see in the left side kind of silos of functions within the IT department at each layer, supporting the layer below, but in a very much of a waterfall fashion where we have the solutions that are being defined by the business, but then they're given to solution architects, who then build, and then they test, develop, et cetera, kind of the typical waterfall process, where the right side, we have organized into teams, and the teams are based on the way the business works. So for a retailer, it might be buying, moving product, and then selling. And within each of those areas, we're organized by capability or experience, and the teams are cross-functional to be able to deliver everything that is needed to enable that experience. The infrastructure is primarily automated and self-service, so that those teams are able to do their own provisioning, their own testing and deployment, and that will obviously allow them to work much more rapidly than when they're working independent on others for doing all that. So now let's turn to the planning, funding, and reviewing model. I'm going to spend several minutes on this because we find it's one of the most challenging things to change in the business, but it's one of the most important for software teams and other innovation teams to work more rapidly. You know, everyone knows the frustration of these multi-year programs that are developed with these very elaborate business cases and very precise set of functionality that is going to be delivered. And a year or two later, you build and you deploy this, and you find, as I was saying earlier, what you've predicted is just simply not what customers need, and you've had very little flexibility along the way to change it because of the way the funding was done. So agile businesses work very differently, and they do it by taking these three different components: the planning, which is identifying and sequencing opportunities; the budgeting, which is just effectively allocating money and people to achieve outcomes; and business reviews, which monitor and act on spending and outcomes based on what we've learned. So just a few tips for how to do this in an agile way. With planning, the key is to plan only as much and only as soon as needed. So not these multi-year detailed plans, but plan more detail for the things that are sooner, but have less granular roadmaps for things that are 6 months, a year, 2 years out, knowing that those are going to change and adapt. Prioritize and sequence initiatives to minimize work in process and multitasking. We know that multitasking makes people much less effective. And for example, someone working on 3 projects at a time loses about 40% of their productivity. And the same is true for organizations that try to do too many things at once. Far better to do fewer things at a time, get them done more rapidly, and move on to the next one. And then consider all plans to be adaptive, revise them regularly in the light of new information. So we avoid these multi-year fixed plans and roadmaps that lose touch very quickly with what customers and the environment really need. In budgeting, It's to prioritize strategic imperatives while welcoming unplanned initiatives. So we don't want to be in a situation where we spend every last dollar for the year and have no way to change that, because we know things are going to come up that are going to be more important than the things we're already working on. Fun, persistent agile teams. I've already talked about the importance of teams that are together sometimes for years at a time. Even though they have a lot of flexibility in what they're working on and how they're doing it, they're building a lot of benefit by staying together on similar topics. And then use a venture capital approach that adjusts budgets based on results. When you start things, don't fund them for 2 years. Fund them for a short period of time. See which ones are working better, just like a venture capitalist would. Double down on those and cut back on the ones that aren't. And then finally, the review process is very important. Creating frequent and transparent opportunities to compare actual versus expected performance. And as I was saying, have those forums that when performance falls below expectations, there is an ability to either pivot and adapt to get them back up, or to actually move the funding to something that's going to be more productive. So this idea of having at least quarterly, sometimes monthly reviews, as many more adaptive businesses do, as opposed to kind of big annual, how do we do for the year? Even though there's a big benefit in working with products, which is what these persistent agile teams are often called, there is still a certain amount of work that needs to be done in projects. It is temporary by nature. It's very large by nature and transitional, so that you do need projects or initiatives. Those should be done based on VC funding. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment, where products, where you're persistently funding the product and giving the team a lot of flexibility, you are giving them more goals in terms of objectives to meet, but giving them flexibility in how to meet them. So let's just turn to each of these for a moment. In the traditional approach, as I was describing on the top of the page, you fund everything at the beginning of the year, sometimes even for multiple years at a time, and you then just kind of go down the path and hope it works. we know rarely does it, and you saw some of the pretty bleak data on how well that model works when we started. On large projects, only 9% success rate. Much better is this venture capital approach, where you start with a couple opportunities at a time. You make decisions every couple months based on their performance. You double down on those that are doing better, and you stop the ones that are not. That frees up more money to start some new things that come up, and the cycle repeats. But it means you're really spending your dollars all the time on the investments and the teams that are going to likely give you the best returns. When we are using when we shift now to kind of the product model, thinking in terms of agile teams, I've already talked about some of the things that are typically true. So the agile product can be organized as an experience, capability, or platform. I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. The funding for these teams includes both running the software and changing, so both maintenance, development, and support. The teams use converged backlogs that combines all these things and is always working on the highest priority in a given sprint, and it's some combination of those activities, including things like technical debt reduction. And the teams are best guided and measured by OKRs. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but the idea is that the teams are working towards objectives, and that you've agreed on with them, but they're given a lot of flexibility on how to achieve those objectives. So what do I mean in this product orientation of experiences, capabilities, and platforms? We strongly believe, most businesses, that the elements of software that are interacting with customers should be experience-based, which means how the customer is actually experiencing, interacting with the company, with that product or service. Sometimes they're called customer journeys or episodes, but it would be things like find a product on if you're on a retail website, or buy a new car, or get help for something in need. It's something that a customer is interacting with, and the team is focused around creating and optimizing that experience. There's some work that underlies those experiences that are in the form of capability. So if you're a retailer, again, replenishing stock in a store, accounts payable, etc., some teams will be organized around those. Many of those things support the experiences. And then finally, there are platforms. So some software is going to naturally be fairly broad in scope, like SAP, and those teams, you need some teams to support those underlying platforms in the service of the capabilities and experiences. But the idea is that each team has a specific mission and clear objectives that are together built in a structure that is supporting the entire set of objectives of the enterprise. Just a couple examples of these structures. They tend to be in tiers. So as an insurance company, an auto insurance company, you might be paying claims, and under that, you're doing things like allowing people to get help, filing a claim, checking the status, etc. So, and you work down this structure until you get to a piece of work like getting your vehicle towed that's small enough for a single team to focus on. And I talked about OKRs before, objectives and key results. Many of you are probably familiar with these, but we like them because they're both qualitative and quantitative. The objectives are the business results, the business reasons you're trying to do something, but the results are quantitative measures to ensure that you're actually delivering against those results. And these OKRs should also be structured such that at the top level, you're thinking about the organization's overall objectives. So in this example, it's a healthcare company that's trying to achieve affordability by minimizing total medical costs while maintaining quality. And as it works through its taxonomy or structure of teams, it figures out at each level how that level is going to be contributing to that affordability feature until you get down to the very bottom team. This is a team focused on an app to help a patient select where they're going to get care. And their contribution to this enterprise affordability is to improve the selection and the recommendations to places that are both more affordable and more effective. So there's other teams focused on other elements of this affordability journey. So when you roll up and get all the teams to achieve their individual OKRs, you ultimately achieve the organizational OKRs. So let's now pull the camera back again and think about, how do we accomplish this? Whether it is having the IT or software development organization become agile, or the entire company become agile, we see it as a multi-step process where you first have to get the agile teams to function well. Then you move to a point where you're able to do agile at scale, where you have large numbers of agile teams and teams that are interoperating with one another. But then finally, you move to become an agile enterprise by getting all the other elements of that business system aligned to support those teams most effectively. And over time, you'll see the amount of agile innovation you're doing grows and grows, but still the majority of most companies are still doing routine operations. It's typical company, it's only maybe 10 to 20% of the organization that's working in agile teams. There's some companies, especially software companies or digital native companies or high innovation companies, might have up to 50% of the people in agile teams, but still it's not the whole organization. So that brings me to our key tips for doing Agile right. The first and among the most important is agile your way to agility. Just like you can't predict the perfect design for a product or service, you can't predict the perfect design for agility within a given company. You can't expect the model of one company to work in another. So you have to use a test and learn approach to become agile, starting with a small number of teams, seeing what works most effectively within the organization, identifying the barriers those teams are facing, like the funding or the talent model or the culture, addressing those incrementally. And then as you improve those enablers of agility, you can begin to scale up the agile teams, you learn more and more, you get more success, the whole thing builds on itself. Second, don't force agile everywhere. Agile, again, is effective, at least agile practice is effective for innovation, but not the best way to do operations. When you do launch agile teams, do them right. Make sure the success factors are in place, the right talent, the right understanding of objectives, the right resources. Create one organization mission and opportunities for everyone to learn and grow. Turn boss-centric norms into customer-centric cultures. I talked about that earlier. We want everyone focused externally as opposed to internally. Break work into small batches, rapid feedback loops, clarify decision rights to speed up decisions. And that's very important. It's impossible to empower a product owner on a team if the decision rights of what they're working on in the company aren't even clear. I saw this at a retailer where we had teams working on pricing. We were trying pricing systems. We were trying to empower the product owners, but actually there were 5 different executives that thought they had input into pricing. So there was no way that any one of them could say that person on that team is going to be able to make pricing decisions. Develop agile goals and metrics. We talked about OKRs and the importance of doing that in order to guide the teams. Constantly shift resources to higher value activities. Start stopping faster. One of my favorite phrases. Companies too often have projects that everyone knows are not achieving any value, but there just isn't the mechanism or the courage to stop it. We want you to start stopping faster so you can free up those dollars and people to work on something that's more valuable for the customers and the business. And then finally, I'll close with what I opened. If you and your team are not having fun, you're not doing Agile right, because Agile teams is really nothing more fun than most people have than working on a high performance team, whether that's in sports or in business. So when these teams are working well, the organizations are happy, the people are happy, and that's a big way you can tell that everything is working. So with that, I'm looking forward to questions. I encourage you to visit our website to learn more, and of course hope that you'll have an opportunity to read and find the book beneficial.
Well, thanks a lot, Steve, for a fantastic presentation. It was so lucid and very well articulated. We
Thank you.
had a lot of questions that have come up, starting from Ananta Krishnan, who is an IT veteran. He is asking, how can we use Agile in application support projects, level 1, level 2, level 3 incidents? Is there a mapping with ITIL model to Agile? That is his question.
So, for help desk functions, for example, if that's what we're talking about at level 1 or level 2, that's more of a function that is more of an operations function. We don't typically see that being appropriate for Scrum teams. You might use a Scrum team to help redesign and improve the way that works. Kanban, though, is an agile technique that can be very effective with level 1, level 2 support, where you have a flow of work coming through and you're managing that flow in a very visible and organized way and minimizing work in process. So that can be very effective for level 1 and level 2 support. When you get to level 3 support, we would say that that should probably be part of the development team with these converged backlogs. So if a team that's, once you've identified which capability or system the is relevant, then that team, which knows the software, knows the customers, knows the functionality, is usually going to be best at doing the work, and that can be done within an agile sprint. The way that the teams do it is they leave what we sometimes call a buffer. They leave a certain percentage of their capacity unplanned. So when these level 3 support incidents occur, they actually have the ability to come in and put that into their backlog immediately within the sprint, get the work done, and get it solved.
So practically speaking, when a project is in motion, very often we don't plan for such slack. That is a reality. Like people don't allow that time for slack. So do you see which are the types of teams which have really planned that kind of slack based on your experience? In the industry, in consulting side, or in the manufacturing core industries? Where do you see that happening?
Yeah, well, I mean, agile teams are so, when they're working well, they're so much more productive than traditional teams that we encourage our companies we work with, as they build this capability, to just build that in. So there's a large retailer that I worked with that just always left 30% of the capacity of every sprint for a combination of technical debt reduction and unplanned incidents. So if they had a good sprint and they didn't have any unplanned incidents, they had 30% of the capacity to improve the architecture and the code base and so forth. And when they had unplanned work, that might crowd out some or all of that technical debt reduction, but that's fine because nobody was really counting on that for a deadline. So that's how they managed it, and it's been very effective. And that's something that teams simply, again, they can test and learn their way to figuring out a way to get that to work. But it also means you've got to be more selective. If you're getting all your work in 70% of your capacity, you have to be more selective to only work on the most important stories and the most important capabilities.
Ananta and team, see, once I've asked a related question, and the responses come. If you have any additional follow-on questions, you can unmute and ask directly as well. Okay, that is to ensure that you get the maximum output for your question.
Can I add? Thank you, Rajaram.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Steve. But in typical IT support projects, we are driven with priority of the incident by SLAs. So there will be incidents where we'll have to close it within a couple of hours or 4 hours or 2 hours based on the criticality and the impact. So I will not have time to put it into a sprint type of model where I will have to address the ticket immediately. So can you help us from that angle, please?
Yeah, well, again, if we're talking about operations type incidents, then those teams are not probably working in sprints anyway. If it's a piece of hardware that's down, or if it's something that is related to the IT operations. Those people, maybe they're working in Kanban, but they're going to immediately take a high priority ticket and put that at the front of the queue and work on it. If it's something that requires an application development team, then that's what that buffer is for within the sprint. We're not going to put it at the front of a sprint. We're going to say to the team, stop what you're doing, work on this thing, and then get back to what you're doing. And if we've left, an appropriate buffer most of the time, that's not going to inhibit the team from achieving its sprint goal. Occasionally it will. Occasionally agile teams miss their sprint goal of what they've committed to do, and that happens. But sure, if you've got a 4-hour SLA, I mean, whatever the person's working on, they're going to put it aside and they're going to get that done. But it doesn't need to interrupt the effectiveness of the agile team most of the time.
Yeah. So SLA 4 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours, even 24 hours may not be amenable for a sprint. Unless maybe the 24 hours one you can do it as a sprint and compress the time frame, but the shorter ones obviously may not be amenable.
Right. I mean, just to be clear, if a team is doing most of its work based on 4 or 8 hour turnaround, that's probably not a Scrum team. Again, that's not going to be organized that way. That's more of an operations function. It's not innovation, and that's why we believe you just don't put Scrum teams everywhere. You have to tailor the structure to the nature of the work. But you can still use a lot of agile values and agile principles, and again, even some agile practices like Kanban can be very effective for that.
Okay. So are there any specific, there is a follow-on question to that. Are there areas which are outlined, like these are functions which are not amenable for agile and this kind of sprinting model?
Well, if what you're doing is very predictable and you know how to do it, you know exactly what you want to build and you know exactly how to do it, there's a lot less benefit in iterating and getting feedback. It still could be valuable to build it in smaller pieces. That reduces the risk. But the idea of kind of these demonstrations, iterations, customer feedback, etc., if you're doing I'll give an example. If you are, I used McDonald's before. If you're building a new restaurant in exactly the same footprint, you don't need to be doing sprints for that. You know exactly what you're building and exactly how to do it. You just need a repeatable model to do that. So there could be some type of software work that relates to that, but in our experience, most software work, you don't really know exactly what you need at the beginning, and you don't really know exactly how to build it at the beginning. So it really does benefit as much as almost any other activity in a company of the agile model, especially Scrum with the iterations.
With Agile being highly customer centric and design thinking as well, highly customer centric and experience based, do you see what kind of complementarity or similarity what you see there?
Sure. I mean, when I use Agile, I use it in a very broad sense, so much broader than just Scrum, in a few different ways. First of all, when I think of Agile teams, it's not just Scrum. It's design. Typically, if it's customer oriented, it is design thinking on the front end, and it's DevSecOps on the back end, right? So it's the whole end-to-end process, getting from customer to deployed code, that you really have to be thinking about in terms of agility. And the other dimension is scaling. So, Scrum doesn't really have a specific scaling model associated with it. There is Scrum at scale, but there's also SAFe and various other models that are used for coordinating among agile teams in a more structured way. So I think to be effective at large scale, we need to be able to do all of that.
Yeah, Kumar Venkatesan has asked this question. It's good to adapt Agile for small, medium programs or projects. However, complex projects like metro train, space programs, how can this be applied?
Yeah, that is it's a common I'd say belief, but I'd say misunderstanding that Agile doesn't really scale to very large programs and projects. In fact, the Defense Department in the U.S. is doing more and more work in Agile because they're finding it's more effective. And these are sometimes enormous enormous projects. The Gripen fighter is a fighter jet made by Saab that is one of the, it was the fastest time to market and lowest cost jet of its kind. It was done fully in Agile with an incredibly complex, something like 100,000 components in the hardware, plus millions of lines of software code. And one of the keys to that was modularity. The modularity of the design allowed the teams to work reasonably independently. But of course, there still needed to be a project plan with a timetable that everyone was working to meet. But it was still done in iterative process so that the teams would be constantly improving what they were doing based on feedback. It might not be customer feedback in some cases. It might just be design and engineering feedback, but still. But that really requires having very well-defined interfaces. That's how you get the modularity, and that's a very important part of the work and the coordination. But the way that those teams worked, they had hundreds of Agile teams simultaneously, might even have been thousands doing that work. But they had daily stand-ups, and any impediments or any interdependencies that weren't being managed were surfaced in those stand-ups. And those teams, everyone would have a stand-up, and then they'd have a representative from each team at a scrum of scrums, and then a scrum of scrums. Each 15 minutes, by the end of an hour, they could actually have coordinated impediments across 1,000 teams, just the way the math works, because you've got eight or so people at each level. So that's how those organizations work on very complex projects, but with a high degree of coordination.
Rajamanikam has asked a question: how to convince a government customer, particularly IT, to use Agile in their outsourced projects? Well, what is the real motivation for them to create Agile projects?
So if you're like an IT services firm and you have a customer, and the question is, how do you convince your customer to let you do the project in Agile? Or am I misunderstanding?
Yeah, here the customer is the government.
Oh, the government.
Yeah.
Government. The government. Okay, well, that can be challenging. But we do see, as I mentioned, the U.S. Defense Department, I would say, is one of the most rigorous and slow-moving government entities around the world. It has been moving more and more towards Agile programs. And it started because they began to see the success in a small scale. And they found, one agency, I don't know which ones it was, but they found a few agencies that were willing to work with a few contractors in an Agile way. They demonstrated success, and they found, boy, we can actually get more value from our dollars, and we can get new systems designed and implemented more rapidly. So, I would say that it starts by finding, in every organization, whether it's public sector or private, there are some change-oriented people, some people willing to take even a small risk. You have to find them and partner with them and demonstrate success in the Agile model with them. And then you look for the next most change-oriented person. And after you've done that a few times, hopefully you build up enough success, you can get more and more people on board with it. But I won't pretend that it is not a very, very challenging, thing to try to do.
Raja, if you have additional follow-on on this, please unmute and ask.
Yeah, I know this is a difficult situation I'm also in, and some of my customers are asking. They are primarily IT outsourcing companies where I consult with them. And when I ask them to move to Agile because of a lot of benefits in Agile, their immediate reaction is my customer will not accept. And it's very, very difficult because they are government customers. And it's more difficult in India and China, probably a little easier in US.
Yeah, I can't argue with that. Which is ironic though, because there's so much agile work being done for the private sector in India. But I understand the challenges of change in those government settings. It is. I mean, so the only other method is just, you can offer them faster results at a lower price than the traditional methods, and see if that is of interest to them. Hopefully it will be. But people in government often are pretty risk averse. So start small. Do some small project where you can just demonstrate it's going to work better for them, and maybe they can get to do the next one up.
Thank you, Steve.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
The next question is from Susinder. Susinder, I know your question is around cost, but I'm not able to get my handle around it. You can ask directly to Steve.
Steve, I had asked saying embracing agile among many organizations is like fighting a tiger in terms of cost, because the business ecosystem is more dynamic than ever in the last few decades. The velocity of change is so high that it's not so easy for organizations to switch back and forth in terms of aligning with their business strategies. Is agile flexible enough in terms of cost to accommodate the changes and enable these organizations to grow?
So, Susinder, if I understand what you're saying that can businesses become flexible enough in their spending? When you say cost, do you mean in what they're spending in order to adjust their strategies, sufficiently flexibly?
Here in India, as far as I have known, IT, there is an IT budget, there is an IT cost.
Yes.
There is no agile cost, there is no kind of, IT is not subdivided and costs are provided, budget is providing for those costs. So in that kind of a situation, what really is possible with agile in a situation where changes are taking place rapidly,
Yes.
particularly with many organizations which are, today across the country, many apps are being launched day by day, and the usage of apps is growing. And these apps are also regulated, and there is a lot of changes which are taking place in the market environment. So how much is realistic, and what really is the how to go about allocating budget for agile in an organization?
Yes, well, using some of the principles that I talked about, it really does lend itself towards fixed budgets, because if you're funding persistent teams, you're funding, let's say, a team that's focused on a given app, or a set of teams focused on a given app, you can have flexibility in what those teams are working on, but you're fixing the amount you're spending on the teams, and you're just ensuring they're working on the most important work. So it is actually a very flexible system, even though you can be working within a fixed cost environment. I'm not sure if that addresses your question.
Maybe I can add, Steve, to whatever you are saying. Susinder,
Yeah.
I feel I slightly understand your question. What Steve is trying to say is, if you are working on a product, right, which will take a year or so for development, or longest time, what you do is go for persistent funding, what is called persistent funding.
Okay.
What this means is you will execute the product development in agile mode, with but you will review it periodically, how it is delivering, and also prioritize what is needed for the product in terms of features, and thereby manage the cost. So here you have committed, let's say $1 million for the product. That $1 million is committed, but only thing is after due reviews, it is released. Whereas in the case of projects, what Steve is suggesting is venture capital kind of funding. All right.
Okay.
So even the requirements are not so clear in terms of a product, you have a clear visibility on what you're going to do. Whereas in the case of projects, requirements keep coming, and you want some flexibility in terms of what you want to build in.
Yeah.
So you start with a small budget, right? Even though, for example, VCs, they will say they will fund. First round of funding, we will commit 2 million. Based on how the company evolves, right? We may commit another next round or not. So similar way, what Steve is saying is agile projects. You commit a small funding, then see how the things are being delivered to the business, the outcomes that are getting created, then commit additional funding, right? That is what is called venture capital kind of funding.
Okay.
Exactly.
Fine. So this is to be done at the plant board stage, or is it to be done at the stage of product development?
No, this is you start with this kind of model from a budgeting standpoint,
Okay.
and then evolve it as you move on.
Okay, from a budgeting standpoint. Okay.
Correct. Good.
Thank you.
Yeah, there is a question from Raghav saying, what are the new IT vendor services models? Any examples?
Yeah.
You can elaborate.
So what we are seeing more and more now is for companies to be buying agile team capacity. So the customer is actually supplying the product owner, product management to the teams, but the vendor is doing all the engineering, the Scrum Master, and so forth. So essentially, all you're really selling is capacity. You're not selling specific deliverables. The customer is very flexibly determining what the teams are working on through a backlog process and so forth. And the SLAs just relate to you might be somewhat restricted on turnover or various types of performance, but the software quality, bugs, etc. But mainly the customer is determining, is this team effectively building the things I asked them to do on a sprint by sprint basis? And if so, you keep going, and if not, obviously there could be a change. So that's probably the biggest model difference that we're seeing, as opposed to either traditional staff aug or fixed deliverables. The idea is that the customer is able to get the flexibility of working with in an agile way, even though they don't have the internal engineering capability to do that. And obviously, they're getting the benefit of often lower cost or better talent.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, and by the way, just one other nuance here: if there's a big time zone difference between the customer and the team, we sometimes see what's sometimes called a shadow product owner, where that there's somebody working with the team who's working very closely with the product owner that's in the main locate or the onshore or the other location, and then that coordination that way.
5
Yeah.
minutes.
Okay.
I'll call you back 5 minutes.
Okay.
Hello. Yep. Please, mute. Yeah. Please go ahead, Steve. The next question comes from Thiru. He's asking, what are your thoughts about Spotify Agile Framework versus SAFe?
Yeah. So the Spotify model is kind of a myth, I would say. If you ask Spotify, the people working in Spotify, they say there is no Spotify model. We're constantly changing our model. And the other thing is don't copy us, because this model works because of our culture and our architecture and everything else. So I know there's a model that's been popularized as the Spotify model. I would say, I would come back to my point that a cut and paste does not work. You need to adapt a model to a particular company. That being said, what people kind of call the Spotify model, I think works better where you have greater independence, kind of more modular architecture and less dependence among teams. Safe is particularly good when you have a high degree of interdependency among teams, and that is often the case when you have monolithic architectures or legacy systems, and you need to coordinate weeks or months at a time between different teams in order to make sure that they're all synchronized. That slows you down versus a model like Spotify or Scrum at Scale, etc. But in some cases, it's necessary because of the the long development cycles and the high degree of interdependency.
Okay.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah. Steve,
Welcome. Great question.
from Tejesh Reddy, he's asking, given the shift from traditional metrics to value-based metrics, how to identify value-based metrics for agile process?
For the agile process, or do you mean how about value? Do you mean just value-based metrics for the agile teams, whatever they're working on?
Yeah, Tejesh, it is for the agile process. That means agile teams as well. That is what.
Yeah, hi, this is Serenia on behalf of Tejish. Yeah, sorry, my question was on the agile teams, how to measure the value-based metrics for the agile teams.
Yes, so that's a great question, and this is an acquired skill to be able to do that. But for each team, as you're developing these OKRs, that again, or any other metrics, it's important to think from a customer perspective and from a business perspective about what value that team is creating and how to measure it. So we even go to the point of saying, don't even stand up a team until you know what value that team is going to create. And in practice, we see organizations creating something called often called a value management function or organization. That is, it's a small group of people. It sometimes has finance people or data scientists or analysts, etc., who help teams quantify, both kind of instrument and quantify what they're working on in order to bring it back to a value metric. So, for example, in that healthcare example I gave of the team that was trying to reduce healthcare costs, but what that specific team was charged to do was to give people a better answer as to what type of care they should achieve. So in that particular case, they were trying to reduce unnecessary emergency room visits. And they worked with this value management group to say, if they can reduce by 1% emergency room visits, how many dollars is that worth? And that's what they use to measure value. So it does take a lot of time and effort and patience, but that's the kind of thing you need to work through for each team in some fashion.
Oh.
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
Oh, you're welcome. And by the way, the other thing I'd say is it's never going to be perfect, and it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be, directionally giving the guidance the teams need in order to know if they're improving.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks.
Steve, there are still a few more questions, but in terms of time, so we seem to have exhausted the original discussed time. What is your view? I don't want to hold you because I know it is late in the night for you.
Yeah, we should probably wrap up pretty shortly. I'm also happy I'm happy to answer some other questions offline. And we also have an Ask the Authors feature on our website. If you go on there, we submit people submit questions, and we're always adding new responses there. So you'll see more and more. But maybe time for one more question.
Okay, sure. So how do you capture, Ramesh is asking, how do you capture innovation in sprint cycle or the teams? And how to assign IP when multiple teams are working together?
I'm not sure
Yeah.
I fully understand the question.
Ramesh, do you want to give some background, or can I elaborate on this?
Yeah, I'll quickly elaborate that. So what I'm asking here is that in teams, agile teams, when multiple people work with as a team. So when you have create some innovation on the shop floor, when you are developing it, there is a little bit of complexity with respect to how would you or to whom you would assign the IPs that are being generated, because it's a team effort. So is it like a team which will be given the IP with the company, or there will be any, you have seen any examples that individuals and the organization?
Yeah, we usually like them to think about their output as a team. So the whole team is getting credit for the innovation that's occurring. And sometimes it's whole teams of teams. And what you're seeing in scientific research these days is many developments in many fields. There are dozens or sometimes hundreds of people that are given credit because the complexity of developing sometimes new innovations in science and engineering it does require such large teams. So I would say that it works better when you actually think of the innovation as a team effort. And I realize that it might not satisfy some superstars, but we see that the productivity of high functioning teams tends to be much greater than the effectiveness of any individual, no matter how talented. So I think that can be fair to give the credit to the team.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I think you were spot on. I mean, I think a couple of people who may be I won't say productive, but then thinking out of box, and then a little bit, I won't say demotivates them, does not definitely encourage them. But yeah, I also see that more and more it is a team assigned IP when we adopt agile.
Yes. Well, they'll get a lot more IP out of it. I promise you, if they work as individuals.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Thank you, Steve.
Great.
Democratization and socialism.
Well,
thanks a lot, Steve, for a fantastic session. I would like to request Raghav, our steering committee member, to share the vote of thanks.
Thanks, Rajaram, sir. And thanks, Steve, for joining all the way from California. In the promotions, we mentioned that he's a partner at Boston office. Actually, he's on travel. And then he started traveling last week, I think. Thanks, Steve, for making it all the way from California. In fact, we wanted to do this session much earlier, but again, we had the Christmas holidays, and then he was also on travel, and then finally we ended up with this date. And thanks, Steve, and thank you so much for covering various aspects on Agile. In fact, you started with the very first statement of doing Agile right is actually having fun, the team having a lot of fun, and ended with the same statement, doing Agile right is actually having the fun. And also succeeding in a black swan impacted, affected world can be only done through agile ways of working, and then creating an organization obsessed with learning, innovation, and delivering superior results to customers. And then how do we run the business and renew the or changing the business, that is innovation, the ops versus innovation segregation. and the touching upon innovation, the assembly line, how it happens from the ideation to go live. So, and the traditional approach versus the agile approach, from perfect predictions and planning to rapid learning. And at the very core, you mentioned the golden mean is creating a balanced system of is an agile enterprise, and you took us through various steps on agile budgeting, reviewing, and planning as well. And thank you so much for enlightening us. And thank you so much once again. Thanks for all the participants. Hey, thanks, Rajram sir.
Thank you. I really, again, I appreciate the invitation. I very much enjoyed the questions. It's a great group, and I hope to see you again at some point and continue the discussion. But thank you, everyone.
And next time in your India visit, please make sure you include Chennai.
I will definitely take you up on that. Fantastic.
Yeah, and on a closing note, many of the questions that you want to have it answer, please read his book, Doing Agile Right. He has answered whatever he has covered. He has detailed much in the book. Probably we encourage you to read that. So that inspired us to invite Steve to this forum. Thank you once again.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Okay. Bye-bye. Have a great weekend.
Yeah, thank you. You too.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks.
And to Vijayinti and a few others whose questions